So, good evening, everybody. It's 6 p.m. on Sunday, the 10th of November. So, we're going to get going with this evening's live. And the intention of this live is to give as much time over to you guys if there's any questions and answers. But I am just going to spend 5 minutes just covering a little poll that I've done over the weekend and also a recap of the triage process, which is really crucial. So, just as a reminder, if people go to the YouTube channel, they will be able to see some of the previous lives. So, in particular, if you wanted to kind of understand the basics of kind of what's going on, what annual allowance actually is, what are these brown envelopes, what's this whole process all about, probably the most useful one is this one that was streamed about 3 weeks ago called your RPSS. What is it and why is it important? So feel free to go and recap that one. That amazingly had almost 9,000 views. I think another really important one because of the budget last week is there was a couple here on the budget. One from I did it with a financial planner from Mazars and others with an accountant from Mazars, and so you can get two different views on that. And although the budget was a little bit of a sigh of relief, I think for most people who may have been expecting worse news in relation to their pensions and pensions taxation, it was a big budget and there's a lot in there that relates in particular to GPs or people that work through a limited company, for example. So feel free to review that. So this weekend I also did a quick poll just to try and capture where we're up to with kind of brown envelopes, in particular in England, Wales. We know that Scotland are behind on RPSSs. Northern Ireland were a little bit delayed, but I think are kind of catching up. But I just wanted to get a snapshot of where we were in England and Wales. We certainly had figures that the government had given to us, telling us how many people had been sent these brown envelopes and what percentage they thought had been covered. And I think it's fair to say the numbers in this poll suggest that it's significantly lower than that indicated. So what we'd asked was, if you were in England and Wales, if you'd had an AA charge between 2015 and 2022, i.e. you're in the group that definitely would be getting a remedial pension savings statement, and also in a group that almost certainly would have been getting a refund in those years, not necessarily the 22-23 tax year because that had never been assessed, but in the previous years, if you'd had an AA tax charge, it's very likely, apart from certain groups, that you might be getting a refund. And this was the results, and I was a little bit surprised that these numbers were so low. And so I did it in three forums, so Doctors Net UK, Facebook and Twitter. The Facebook group is just an all consultant group that I'm in, and they had the highest groups of yes, so that's kind of 48%. Twitter, I probably still do have more consultant followers than GPs, and DN UK is probably a much more equal mix of consultants and GPs, and you can see that their yes rate was a shocking 35%. And we know that one of the reasons that RPSSs haven't been sent out is if you've got gaps in your pension record. And unfortunately, in England in particular, for GPs having to deal with PCSE, pension records are a complete car crash. And so those people won't be getting these brown envelopes until the gaps in their pension records up to the 22-23 year it is fixed. But, overall, across nearly 830 people that answered yes or no, in that group in England and Wales, still a very disappointing, only 45% have received one. And if you kind of put that into context, we've kind of known about these deadlines for years now, and all the information potentially has been there for years as well for pensions agencies to do these calculations. There was a very clear statutory deadline based on the beginning of October, the 6th of October, and here we are on the 10th of November, and only 45% of people have received those brown envelopes. I think that's a pretty poor show, to be honest. And of course, in some nations and in some schemes that also affect doctors, like doctors in the armed forces, obviously very relevant to today's happenings as well. Unfortunately, very large numbers of those haven't got anything at all, and all of that's been delayed, and that's a great shame, because I think it's just all adding to the stress and the hassle and the discrimination that these people have already gone through. So anyway, so I'm just going to spend just 5 minutes on triage, because that's a really important bit of the process. As I said, if you want a more full thing, go to the earlier YouTubes, and then you can see what's going on there. But essentially, the HMRC have created a process to take all of this outside the normal self-assessment process. And so it's called the HMRC Digital Service, and it's like a 220 page tool. And the first bit of it is called triage, and that's to try and help determine if you need to use the full tool or not. And if you, inverted commas, fail triage, you get to this screen which says you are eligible to use the Public Service Pensions Adjustment Service. And that's kind of a crucial page that kind of indicates you're going into the full tool now, but it's also the one that should kind of just set alarm bells going that you're going to need lots of very detailed financial information. There's lots of pitfalls that you can get wrong, so this is where you can definitely call for help if you've not already called for help, and say let's get some professional help, and that can be reimbursed. So just if I just move over, I'm going to show you my RPSS, and we're just kind of very quickly going to go through it. So this is the triage page. If you haven't already got it, I think I'll put the link in the chat as well if that button works. But if not, you can use this link here or this QR code. And what you can see here is just kind of a one-page triage that I've developed that will just kind of go through these crucial 6 questions. And I'll come back to those in a second. I'll just talk through my RPSS very briefly. So page 1, just a bit of bump explaining what the annual allowance is and why they've sent you a statement. Page 2, importantly, says what they've sent and what they've not sent. So, for example, this includes your 22-23 normal pension saving statement, because that year has never been assessed. So don't be entirely surprised if people are talking about getting refunds for the 7 remedy years, but you've got a tax charge to pay in the 22-23 tax year. That's just because that was meant to have been assessed last year, but wasn't because of this whole process. And it says your 23-24 will be sent separately. But of course, in a separate poll I've done over the weekend, very few people have got those despite asking, and I've asked 3 times for mine and haven't received mine either. We then kind of go on to the tables. So there's this kind of, sorry, this doesn't project very well because it's sideways, but this shows all of the new pension input amounts split between the 2 schemes. We've got the old pension input amount split between the 2 schemes, and we've got the scheme pays loans again split between the 2 schemes. So you can see I've had scheme pays loans in lots of scheme years during the remedy period, but I've also paid cash in some years, and so crucially this doesn't show what you may have paid of cash. So if you've only paid cash via self-assessment, then you'll need to cross-reference that with previous tax returns to know what you've paid to see if you are eligible for a refund. This is just some more kind of detailed information. I've highlighted one line here because it might be relevant to you, and that's the 15-16 year, because these closing values are really telling you what your pension was at the end of that tax year. So I was in the 1995 scheme then, and if I divide that £350,000 number by 19, it tells me what my pension was at the end of the 15-16 tax year. Now, I'm nowhere near having a pension at £1 million then, but some people will be. And so if you've got a figure in this cell here in 15-16 of above 826087, that meant you had a pension of £1 million. And if you've not already got something called IP16, which is a lifetime allowance protection, you need to Google that and find out about that smartish. Because although the lifetime allowance has been abolished and thankfully didn't come back with a budget, there's still some ramifications about tax-free lump sums, and it's important that you know about them. This page, again, just some more kind of detailed information, but in England and Wales at least, this is kind of the money page, and it's a summary page that's got all the really helpful information. So what we've got is the combined amounts across the 2 schemes for all of these 3 columns, and so we've got the old pension amounts and the new pension input amount. So this is before McLeod rollback, this is after McLeod rollback, and we've got those scheme pays again So if we just go back to these triage questions. So question 1, have you paid an AA charge in those 7 years periods, either via scheme pays or self-assessment? So I've not got my self-assessment forms here, so I can't assess that, but I already fail on this because I've had multiple scheme pays loans, so that's it. I'm a triage fail. I know I've got to use the full service. Question 2 just asks you if your contributions have changed. This is only relevant for a very small proportion of NHS members who are locum GPs subject to something called annualisation. And so if you're not a locum GP and your accountant's never told you about annualisation, it doesn't affect you. It's really tiny numbers. And if it does, they've got some additional questions. Question 3 is an important one. Have any of your contributions higher in any year between the pre and the post rollback in that 7-year period here? So I can see here, if I go to mine, all of mine are lower. So I can see here that 43 becomes 36, 51 becomes 44, 37 becomes 13, etc., etc. But if any of yours go up, that's a triage fail, and you've got to use the full service. So question 4, is your 22-23 weight greater than 40k? So that's the yellow cell here. So if I go to my summary page, I can see that mine is just over that 40k at 4287, so that would be a triage fail. I need to use the full service. Is your net income greater than 190? Now, it's interesting, for those of you that know about tapering, the threshold income limit in the 22-23 tax year is 200k, not 190k, and there's a reason why HMRC have put a kind of buffer in there, and that's because they want to do the detailed calculations in the back end to check that you're calculating threshold income and adjusted income correctly, because they know that individuals, accountants and IFAs have definitely got that wrong, so they'll be doing all of that in detail. And question 6 is just again kind of a rare niche one, and it's for people that have had private pensions, not NHS pensions that they'd accessed after 2015, and then they're continuing to contribute again into a private pension, nothing to do with the NHS pension, above £4,000. It's something called the money purchase annual allowance, but the vast majority of people aren't affected. And so the reason why all of this is important is if you fail on any of these, and if you fail on one, you don't need to go on to the subsequent questions. It means you fail triage and need to use the full service. And the relevance of that is for those that do need to use the full service, they can access compensation for accountancy. So if you scan this QR code at the bottom, you can register for the service, and if you do the one at the top, you can find out more information about the service, and that means you can claim up to £1,000, including VAT, to do all of this kind of horrendous process for you. So if we just kind of go back over to exactly what that horrendous process is, and just advance to the next slide. So just before we talk about the digital service itself, who are for this Mazars? So about half of doctors use an ASMA accountant, and ASMA are the Association of Specialist Medical Accountants, and we know that more than half of annual allowance charges paid by anyone in the UK are paid by doctors. So medical specialist accountants really have become the experts in the annual allowance, and Fulvis Mazars are a leading member of ASMA. I would have liked to have tried to do a kind of user-led calculator, as I've done previously with the union, etc., but it's just too complicated. And so this, what I've developed for them is a suite of tools that accountants use, so professionals use, and they can work out exactly what compensation you due. They can double check that the HMRC calculator produces the accurate number for what you're due to get back, and they can do the whole process from beginning to end. Because it's complicated, it's actually done by 2 accountants. So there's one that processes all the data at the beginning and works out what compensation you're due, and then it goes into the service and then comes back from HMRC with the answer, and then it's all checked over by a second accountant in a so-called 4-eyed check. And as I said, it's an end-to-end service, so they will get all the information for you from HMRC, from the pension scheme. They'll submit the claim to HMRC as your agent. They'll also deal with a compensation claim pardon me, at the end. So this is what the digital service looks like. I'll just kind of start it in fast forward. So this is going at 20 times speed. It's around 200 pages of detailed financial information there's absolutely loads of scope for getting this wrong, and not least through just kind of fatigue. It's asking for detail of about 13 tax years. My strong advice is, if you fail triage, is use a qualified medical specialist accountant who's professionally accountable for getting all of this stuff right, and don't risk it yourself, because I think there's a huge scope for error. So anyway, I think we will now move on to the Q&A. I'm not going to do kind of any more slides, because I've done those previously. I had hoped that the questions would have appeared on the side of the screen, but I'm obviously not clever enough to have made that work. So what I will do is just go over to my wife Jo's in the chat. We had some pre-submitted questions, and then obviously if you subscribe you can ask questions now, so I'll just kind of go through those, and we'll stop when the questions end, or in about an hour's time. So question 1 was from Greg. Do you know if we definitely get an RPSS envelope if we haven't gone over any limits? I'm pretty sure I didn't go over any limits at the time. NHS part-time, but I have a separate SIP, so I need new workings for pension planning. I'm not sure if I'll get anything. So no, so this kind of comes back to that page 1 of the letter, if I can find it. And they explain that they only send this if you've gone over the general annual allowance. So actually that's not quite true. So they will send you an RPSS if you went over the general annual allowance in any year, but also if you requested an on-demand statement. So obviously the BSA don't know if you had a reduced annual allowance due to tapering, for example. So lots of people will have requested these statements from NHS BSA, and all of those people should be getting one as well. But if you've never requested an on-demand statement and you've never exceeded the general annual allowance, then you will need to manually request those figures, so you can work out what's going on in terms of a SIP, etc. So Andrew asks, thanks for keeping us up to date. There is a confirmed error in mine, but NHS BSA don't seem to have any bandwidth for issuing a corrected RPSS. Open quotes, no time scale, close quote. So this no time scale, disgraceful in my opinion, response, I'm afraid, is quite common at the moment from the NHS BSA, and they appear to forget that there was a statutory deadline of the beginning of October, which they've now passed, and there's also a statutory requirement for them to get the figures right. But they are definitely saying there is no timescale, and I've complained to the BSA and to government, and the BMA have complained, and lots of others have complained about these kind of quite insulting, there is no timescale for any of this stuff, because obviously people need to know what their position is. People will want to do self-assessment for this year. People will want to know if they've got any headroom to be able to contribute into a SIP, or if they're subject to tapering, etc. They'll need to know what the position is. So it's really not good enough, and we've repeatedly raised that, but I'm afraid that's where we are. They're not giving any timescales. So Hayley, I'm picking up on how stressful and the emotional harm this has caused. I, for one, have very much had sleepless nights over this. Really has sent me to the edge. Anyone else, is this a lawsuit in itself? So I definitely feel for you, Hayley. One of the reasons why I'm doing all of these Q&As is to just try and help people through what is a massively difficult time for people and a massively complex process. But I absolutely accept that this is kind of insult to injury on top of the discrimination that people have already had. And the BMA did put out an additional set of legal claims for injury to feelings, and I can't remember the exact number. I think there's about 10,000 people that have registered for those additional claims for injury to feelings. So that's absolutely something that is happening in the nations, because all of this is stressful and difficult, and people are only having to do this because of the discrimination. So what I would say to people is, if you fail triage, leave this to the professionals. You will get your money back for this, and that will definitely reduce the stress involved of having to go through a very complicated process. And so again, that's another reason why I've kind of done all this stuff as well, just to try and help people get the compensation that they're due and do it in a way that's minimal hassle. So that would be my advice: is if you fail triage, give it to somebody else to sort out. And if you don't fail triage and you still need somebody else to do it, do that as well. And those people can put in a claim, but it's less certain. It'll be on a case by case basis whether or not you'll be able to get kind of accountancy fees back in that setting. So Julie asks, still haven't got my envelope despite having paid scheme pays a couple of years ago. Should I do something to chase? So I just showed you that poll from the beginning. I'm just going to go to a slide that I did from a couple of weeks ago in one of the webinars because it's kind of relevant. So it's kind of this bit down here. So what to do if you've not received one yet. So they had indicated to us that 57,000 went out. We think the denominator is probably around 80,000. So we would have hoped that it was kind of well above 50%, but it clearly isn't. So perhaps those numbers aren't quite correct. I think, given that we're over a month past the statutory deadline, people have got to decide what they want to do for this tax year. It's entirely reasonable to, in writing, by email, chase the scheme and ask them what's going on. And I think what I would ask people, what I would ask the BSA is to tell me which of one of these three groups in. So one, am I in the group where you've done the calculations? In which case, can you email me my RPSS as an unencrypted PDF? Because what I'm reading from that poll data is perhaps they haven't printed out and sent them all out yet. So there may be some that they've calculated that just haven't gone, or they've been lost in the post, or the post has been eaten by the dog or whatever. So I would ask them, one, have you done my RPSS? If so, email it to me. Two, am I in a significant group that requires manual calculations? And if I am in a group that requires manual calculations, how long are they going to take? Or three, and this applies specifically for GPs, I would say, am I in the group where you don't have all the data? And if so, can you tell me what data you're missing so I can kind of chase my employer or PCSE to fill that data in? I think it's entirely reasonable for people to ask those questions, given that we're a month past the statutory deadline. And I think it's very disappointing that such big numbers of people haven't got that information. So that would seem entirely reasonable to me. Moving on. Steve says, my accountant says I don't need to pay any additional AA tax having reviewed my RPSS, despite me failing triage. She's done my tax returns for years and I trust her advice. Does this mean I don't have to do the 200 page, or am I obliged to do it if I fail triage? So this is a really good and important question. It's something that we asked HMRC directly about. So the position that we put to the Inland Revenue was that if the charge points to doing a full submission, for example, because 22-23 is over 40k, so remember that was that yellow cell on the triage tool that I created. All other questions would lead to no submission being needed. Under a normal pension saving statement year, you would make no disclosure on the tax return. And so, do we need to do anything? And HMRC's response was, if triage has been calculated that a submission needs to be made, then there may be a reason for this that is not displayed. We would therefore suggest making a submission. So I think what we've got to remember is that this horrendous 200-page process is not something that any of us wanted or we've created. This is a tool that government have created, and this is the way that government want you to deal with this problem. And so if you fail triage, I would take it as an opportunity to get all of this looked at by an accountant in a fully compensable way, and make sure that you've ticked all the boxes that government have asked of you to prove that you do or don't have a refund, or you do or you don't have any tax to pay. And that's certainly how I'm going to look at it. But fortunately, I am going to be getting quite a big refund because I've paid lots of AA tax charges, and the vast majority of people that have paid tax charges will be in that position because everyone's tax position is going to change because of McLeod. So my advice is that if you fail triage, then even if your accountant is telling you there's nothing to do necessarily, I would do the process, not least because you might then have to pay your accountant for them to have got to the position to have worked out that there was nothing to do, but then you don't have a claim to make in the cost claim back scheme because you haven't used the full service, and you do need to produce evidence that you've used the full service to be able to claim that back. So that would leave you with an uncompensable claim potentially as well. So SVS says, I have a 22-23 excess above 40k, hence failed triads. Registered, should I mention that in the tax return? Or once FM HMRC full service done, numbers will change, I guess. Yeah, so really good question. So, but, this is one of the things we keep on, telling to government when they've not been playing ball with giving people their 23, 24 numbers, is people need them for to work out what their position is this year. So people need the RPSS to work out the carry forward position is, and then they're going to need the 23, 24 figures to do self-assessment for this year. So in terms of the remedy stuff, that can all be left to Forvis Mazars. They'll sort out your compensation bit, but you'll need to know what the outcome of that is to accurately produce your position for 23, 24. What I would say, and SVS hasn't said whether they're a GP or a consultant, but if you are a consultant, the vast majority of consultants, unless they've had a significant pay rise, are not going to have a charge in 23-24, and that's because 23-24 was the first year with a higher allowance. It's 60 instead of 40, and it's also a year where negative growth started, and our pay was absolutely trashed in 23-24. So your pension was allowed to go up by 10.1%. That was the opening value, and most people will have got a pay rise between 4 and 6%, depending on if they had any old style CAs. So most people will find that they have very large negative growth and they won't have a charge. For me, people saw from my pension savings statement I had scheme pays years every year. I've had a tax charge every year for as long as I can remember, but for 23-24 it's going to be the first year that I don't expect to get one. So even though I've not got my numbers on my tax return, I'm going to be saying I don't think I've got a tax charge, but I can't tell you what the final position is until I get the detailed figures from the scheme. So I hope that answers your question. So Jamie says, for anyone who signed up with Mazars, activated the portal, uploaded the requisite initial information, do you just wait for the engagement letter? So yes, I probably should have had I've got like a diagram of the process that I'll try and find in the background and bring up to show you guys. But yes, it should all be in hand. If they're waiting for any information from you, automatic email should go out to you every Friday. But there are some bits of the process where they're just waiting for checks to come through, or they're waiting for information to come back from HMRC or others, and so there are some built-in delays to the system that are outside their control. But if you're worried about it and you haven't had anything back, and it's you've waited a while, you can email them back on the same email address that the emails come from, and they'll be able to pick that up for you. SVS, a great effort from you to nail this problem through various social media forums. BSA has got a lot to answer for and to be accountable for this mess. Thanks a lot, Venkat. Yes, I agree. And I do have some pity for BSA, but on the other hand, I think a lot of it is due to huge under-resourcing. So for example, I talked about this in last week's YouTube or the one before. We were promised in 2020 that all pension savings statements information was going to be in an online portal. No brown envelopes, no having to request things. It was all going to be there by June 2020. Pardon me. Here we are 4.5 years later, and we have no online portal that's got any useful information on annual allowance. And they've just failed to invest in digitisation, and so they'll be getting tons of queries about these brown envelopes through no fault of their own in failing to invest in things like a portal, which is what they promised to do, what is already in existence in Northern Ireland and Scotland, but they've just failed to invest. So it's on them really. And part of the problem, and doing a lot of work on this in the background with the BMA and others, and all the other unions are on board with this as well, is we spend a pittance on pensions admin in the NHS. So if that employee contribution rate, 0.8% goes on pension scheme admin. And if we compare that to comparable public sector schemes in the UK, they spend much, much, much more, and they get much better quality than we do with the NHS BSA. And ultimately what needs to happen is they need to spend more money. So at the moment they've got too few people chasing their tails, they've not invested in digitisation, they've not modernised, and now it's all, I'm afraid, looking really bleak, and that's causing huge stress for us who are kind of at the receiving end of poor service. But ultimately, that's what they need to do, is they need to spend more money. So the government needs to fund BSA admin properly. With the biggest DB pension scheme in Europe, by far the biggest pension scheme in the UK, and these levels of service are frankly just completely unacceptable, in my opinion. Catherine, do you think HMRC will extend the January 31st deadline for those of us with no RPSS likely to have a tax charge? So I am just going to bring over this diagram here. So hopefully you can see this. The deadline is not the 31st of January 2025 for everybody. So there's a number of things in play here. So if you don't have any overpaid tax charges at all, and you only have a refund, for example, then your deadlines are much later. But if you do have any new or increased tax charges, and bear in mind the 22-23 tax year is never been assessed, so lots of people will have a tax charge if they were in paying tax charges before for the 22-23 tax year. And for those people that haven't retired by 1st of October, then that is the deadline, the 31st of January. But from your question, you were saying you're in this group that haven't received an RPSS. So if you haven't received an RPSS, that automatically gives you 3 months from when you receive it. So I mean, it's disappointing that you haven't received it, and 55% of people in England and Wales who should have received one haven't received them, based on that poll of 820 people. But in terms of deadlines, you don't necessarily need to lose sleep over the deadline. That said, that is going to affect your ability to do self-assessment properly, and it might affect decision making about this year and private pensions and tapering and overtime and all of those things. So it's completely unacceptable that the government have put you in that position. But in terms of the deadline, you don't need to worry about it because you've got 3 months from receiving your RPSS. So just move this back over here and then see if I can find where I was, because I had to scroll up to get to that one. Mel, I bought additional pension during the remedy period. I've not had an RPSS yet. Will the pension growth from the additional pension be included in the year it was bought in the RPSS? So I'm not entirely sure whether or not you mean additional pension, because very few people do buy additional pension. Some people do. It's not very good value compared to the old added years. Assuming you mean added years, which was the more common one, it should be included. And in fact, it all gets a bit messy with added years, because what we do know is that early on in the remedy period, the BSA miscalculated pension growth figures for people with added years. In fact, I was the person that initially raised that with them when I did the BMA Goldstone modeler and calculated it correctly. It was at odds with the BSA figures. So you may find yourself kind of with 3 sets of figures: the figures that you were initially issued, the recalculated figures from BSA that do correctly include your added years, pre-rollback, and then the including added years post-rollback. The only figures that HMRC Digital Service are interested in is your post-rollback new issued figures. So they need to know what the new figures are post rollback to work out what your new tax liability is, and they obviously want to know whether or not you've paid tax through cash or scheme pays to work out the refund or not. It's probably also worth mentioning here, it's not part of your question, but just kind of in more general terms, is quite a lot of people I know did stop added years contracts during the remedy, because they had big pension tax charges with the introduction of the new 2015 scheme, which wasn't the original deal, and so they stopped it. So people that did stop added years contracts between October 2014 and April 2022 will be given the opportunity to buy those back. So if that's you, you can access that via something called contingent decisions. And I've deliberately kind of not talked a huge amount about contingent decisions in any of these lives that I've been doing yet, because the full process for that hasn't been published. So we're still waiting a little bit on what contingent decisions looks like. And once that process is out, I'll probably do a whole dedicated YouTube just on contingent decisions, because it's a really big and important area. And I'll probably do that with one of my planning colleagues from Forvis Mazars, because in terms of this kind of RPSS process and correcting tax, that's very much accountancy work, and the best person to deal with that, and essentially what they're doing is resubmitting 8 years tax returns via this digital service. The experts in that are medical accountants, but the contingent decisions bit is a slightly different piece. And so what you're trying to work out is, if you buy back opted out service or missing years, it's going to cost you X pounds, and you're going to get a benefit Y, and is it worth it, and what's the best way of structuring that, and do you buy some of it or all of it, etc. That's a complex financial planning issue, and so I'll probably do another YouTube later that with one of the planning team from Forvis Mazars. And one of the reasons I went with Forvis Mazars, incidentally, was because they have real strength both in medical accountancy and financial planning, so they can kind of do all of that under one roof. Catherine says, I've emailed and be told that I'm due an RPSS and they have no timescale to send it out. So I think I've covered that. This no timescale thing is just BS, isn't it? It's a really rude and flippant way to treat people that have been subject to discrimination, and turn round over a month after a statutory legal deadline to turn around to people and say, we've got no timescale for it, do better. That's BSA, not you, Catherine. You're doing fine. Harish asks, big difference in advisor pension report projection 12 months ago and RPSS. RPSS no growth. Advisor predicted 22-23 and 23-24. 3-month hokey in 21-22 and lease car end 2024. Help tar. So interestingly, I got a report just under 12 months ago from one of the big names, and my numbers are way out as well. And it's the biggest factor by far for pension growth prediction is how much your pensionable pay goes up by and what happens to inflation. And so a lot of the kind of crystal ball gazing that people used to pay money for into the future, I think has become of much more limited value when inflation is all over the place, and we're also in a period of pay restoration. So it's much more unpredictable what's going to happen to pay, because our pay is still way down compared to what it was in real terms and what it should be. And so predicting anything beyond the current year is a bit voodoo, and I wouldn't take it. But it sounds like you're kind of more complex because you've been in and out of the scheme and had a lease car and stuff. So it might be that your numbers are incorrect. In which case, then that would need to go back to the scheme for them to correct it, and there's currently no timescale for that. Ben asks, what is the penalty to the scheme of them missing a statutory deadline? Who enforces that? Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a question that we've been asking in the background in the BMA and stuff as well, about what regulatory options are there, etc., etc. So there should be a penalty for late production of these numbers. There should also be, based on that question above about incorrect numbers, there should also be a penalty for incorrect numbers. watch the space, Ben. Catherine says, but we still have to submit self-assessment by 31st of Jan, so have to guess pension tax charges for that tax return. And that, unfortunately, is correct. So you are expected to guess / estimate what your numbers will be. Now, we've written to the relevant minister in HMT to say that is a ridiculous ask. You know, government last year in August, the newsletter came out saying, you know, you don't have to guess what your numbers are for 2023 because it's very difficult, because they acknowledged that people couldn't do that if they didn't have the 7 years data before. How on earth could they possibly guess what their tax position was with all of that missing data? So the only thing that's changed between last year and this year is that there's another year's missing data. So how they expect people to do it is a little bit ridiculous. So, you know, a bit like the comment above, I don't know whether you're a GP or a consultant. If you're a consultant, you've not had a big pay rise, you're likely to be in a good position for 23-24, in that a lot of people will have large negative growth and against the higher allowance, you know, unless you're kind of fully tapered. A lot of people will be okay. But, you know, we've written to the minister saying you're putting people in an impossibly difficult position. How on earth are they able to estimate what their position is? And I know others have as well. So the chief executive, SPPA in Scotland, has said because their RPSS are even more delayed than the situation in England. It's just a very unfair position to put people in. So Rabbit asks, I did not start added years because I could see that I would be in trouble with AA. Could I go back and buy them back now? I can't remember the exact years that added years stopped, but it was way before the beginning of 2015. So I think nice try, but I think that would have a very small chance of success, because added years have been closed off way before the remedy period started. Just a comment in general terms for anyone that has added years, or for anyone that has stopped added years during those 2 dates that I mentioned, which was October 14 to April 2022, added years were incredible value for money, because you still essentially get all of the value of the employer contribution into the way that the added years cost was calculated. You know, and bear in mind, you know, so currently now in England and Wales, we're typically paying 12.5% for a higher earner, and the government are paying, you know, 23.7%. So the employee contribution is a really important part of the value of those, and that's accounted for with added years. So they're brilliant value for money for people with, you know, normal life expectancy. They're really good value for money, and don't stop them. So yes, you will have higher pension growth, and so you might have more annual allowance charge, but overall they're incredibly good value for money. Compare and contrast to added pension is a completely different equation. So you know, the additional pension that you can buy, essentially you're paying the full value of it. So you're paying essentially the equivalent of both the employee and the employer contribution, and also the pension that you're buying isn't the same as the 2015 pension. So 2015 pension benefits from revaluation, and so what revaluation means is that you get 1/54th of your pensionable salary. So let's just say your pensionable salary was 54,000, and so you pay into the scheme and you'll get 1/54th, so you'll get £1,000 of pension. But then that £1,000 of pension is revalued every year, and it's revalued by inflation plus 1.5%. And I know that 1.5% sounds puny, but you know, if you're a long way from retirement, that compounding interest will add up. Additional pension doesn't include that 1.5%, so it only revalues by inflation, which basically means, you know, so if you buy £1,000 now, it will be worth in real times that same £1,000 in 30 years' time when you retire, if you're going to retire in 30 years' time. So you're paying a lot more for it because you're basically paying the employee and the employer contribution, and you're getting pension that's less valuable than the current normal pension that you're buying. So, some people may do the maths and still decide that they want to do it, but in terms of value for money, it's a very different equation to how things were previously. And I think we may be out of questions. We are out of questions, which is great, which obviously means that everyone now understands everything about all of these brown envelopes. So I will continue doing these for as long as people have still got questions out there, because a lot of people still do need support. I'll just go over to the slides quickly and just go over to these two QR codes. So if you want to read more about the service and what Forward Mazars can do for you, that's this code on the bottom, and then if you use this QR code on the right, then this is the form that you can access to be able to access the service. My wife, has just said one more question, so we'll do that quickly because we're a bit under time. Yes, I think I've answered that from the same person before. Thank you very much for coming along. Just kind of thinking back to the question that said that they were really stressed out about it and losing sleep. Please try not to lose sleep if you can. If you fail triage, use professionals. Let them take the stress out of it and try and sort this out for you. So please don't have nightmares, and I'll probably be back in a week's time, or if there's any updates in the interim. Thank you very much, everyone.